2 miles of open Tennessee farmland separate John Bell Hood's army from the Union trenches outside the town of Franklin. It is the afternoon of November 30th, 1864, and Hood has just given the order. Nearly 20,000 men will cross that open ground, in daylight, without the artillery preparation that might blunt the defenses waiting for them. His officers have objected. Some have argued the position is nearly the strongest they have seen all war. Hood gives the order anyway. He has done this before, at Peachtree Creek, at Atlanta, at Ezra Church, and each time the army that marched out came back smaller, with fewer veteran officers, fewer horses, fewer men who know how to hold a line under fire. Hood knows the Confederacy cannot easily replace what it loses at Franklin. He orders the attack regardless. The question this raises is not whether Hood was brave or even whether he was right. It is stranger than that. Why does a general who understands he is running out of men keep spending them anyway? And what did he believe each attack might still buy him? To answer that question, the story has to go back to the moment Hood inherited this army, because the pressures that put him on that field at Franklin were already in motion 5 months earlier in the pine woods north of Atlanta. That summer, the Confederacy's Second Great Field Army stood between William Tecumseh Sherman and the industrial heart of Georgia. The Army of Tennessee, under General Joseph E. Johnston, numbered around 59,000 men, a force rebuilt from the wreckage of Missionary Ridge, resupplied as well as the collapsing Southern rail network could manage, and commanded by a general who understood, better than almost anyone in gray, what his army could no longer afford to lose. Johnston's answer to Sherman's superior numbers was patience. He fell back from Dalton to Resaca, from Resaca to Cassville, from Cassville toward Kennesaw Mountain, trading ground for time and trading maneuver for casualties he did not have to pay. It worked in the narrow sense that his army stayed intact. It failed in the eyes of Richmond because Atlanta kept getting closer. Jefferson Davis had never fully trusted Johnston, and by mid-July that mistrust had hardened into alarm. Sherman's armies, well over 100,000 men fed by a single-gauge rail line running back through Chattanooga to Nashville and Louisville, a line the Union had the men and the iron to repair every time Confederate cavalry cut it, were now on the doorstep of Atlanta itself. Davis wanted a fight for the city, not another withdrawal. On July 17th, he relieved Johnston and handed command to John Bell Hood, a 33-year-old corps commander who had already lost the use of an arm at Gettysburg and a leg at Chickamauga, and who was known through the Army as a man who did not flinch from a frontal assault. Secretary of War James Seddon's parting words to him that night, to be wary no less than bold, captured exactly the tension Hood now had to resolve. He inherited an army of just over 50,000 effectives, a mandate to save Atlanta, and almost no time in which to do it. Hood's problem was not a lack of courage or a lack of ideas. It was that Johnston's strategy of maneuver, whatever its logistical logic, had already surrendered so much ground that there was no more room left to trade. Atlanta's rail connections, the arteries that fed both the city and the army defending it, were within days of being cut. Waiting, in Hood's judgment, no longer preserved the army. It simply postponed the moment Sherman choked the city off entirely. So, within 72 hours of taking command, Hood attacked. On July 20th, at Peachtree Creek, roughly 20,000 Confederates struck George Thomas's Army of the Cumberland as it crossed the creek north of the city. The attack was poorly coordinated, delivered piecemeal, and repulsed with about 2,500 Confederate casualties against 1,900 Union. 2 days later came the Battle of Atlanta, a more ambitious flanking attempt against McPherson's Army of the Tennessee east of the city that briefly broke the Union line, killed McPherson himself, but ultimately cost Hood somewhere between 5,000 and 5,500 men to roughly 3,700 Federal losses. 6 days after that, at Ezra Church, Hood attacked again to block Sherman's attempt to reach the last open railroad into the city and lost around 3,000 men to fewer than 650 Union casualties. In 11 days, Hood had fought 3 major battles and lost, by the most reliable tallies, somewhere near 15,000 men. killed, wounded, captured, and missing, while inflicting a fraction of that toll on Sherman. This is the fact that has to sit at the center of any honest account of Hood's generalship. He was not reckless in a vacuum. He was reacting to a strategic emergency that Johnston's withdrawals had created, trying to seize the initiative before Atlanta's supply lines were severed for good. But the arithmetic of those 11 days also reveals the trap closing around him. Sherman could lose 3,700 men at the Battle of Atlanta and still field over 100,000 soldiers the next week, because behind him ran an intact double-tracked rail network reaching all the way to Louisville, feeding replacement rifles, fresh horses, artillery rounds, hardtack, and, crucially, new regiments raised from a northern population and immigration pool the Confederacy simply did not have. Hood had no comparable system behind him. The Confederacy's remaining manpower pool was shrinking, its conscription reach nearly exhausted, its rail network fragmented and poorly maintained, and its ordnance production concentrated in a handful of vulnerable facilities. Every soldier Hood lost at Peachtree Creek, Atlanta, and Ezra Church was, in practical terms, a soldier the Army of Tennessee would never see replaced in kind. Through August, Hood held the city under siege conditions, while Sherman worked at the railroads feeding it rather than at Hood's fortifications directly, a change in method that itself reflected the logistical lesson of the month before. It was cheaper to starve an entrenched enemy than to assault him. By the end of August, Sherman had swung his armies south to cut the last rail line at Jonesboro. Hood detached troops to defend it, was defeated there on August 31st and September 1st, and on the night of September 1st ordered Atlanta evacuated, destroying what military stores could not be carried out. Atlanta fell without another battle for the city itself, more a consequence of a severed supply line than of a single climactic assault. But the campaign that led there had already cost the Army of Tennessee a substantial fraction of the strength Hood had inherited barely 6 weeks earlier. What followed reveals the second half of the paradox. Hood did not believe the loss of Atlanta ended the war in the West. He believed the army could still be useful, and that October he took what remained of it, reinforced to something over 30,000 men, north and west of Sherman's position, hoping to threaten the long Union rail line back to Chattanooga and Nashville, draw Sherman out of Georgia in pursuit, and perhaps carry the war into Tennessee, a state whose recapture still carried enormous symbolic and political weight for the Confederacy. Sherman chose not to chase him. Instead, he split his forces, sending George Thomas back to Nashville with instructions to gather every available man to deal with Hood, while Sherman himself turned his remaining armies toward Savannah and the sea. It was a decision only an army with Sherman's logistical depth could make casually. He could afford to divide his forces because both halves could still be supplied, reinforced, and kept fighting. Hood's march into Tennessee that November was, by his own later writing, meant to relieve the pressure on the Eastern Confederacy and perhaps force a decisive battle on ground of his choosing. What it produced was Spring Hill, where Hood's army came within reach of trapping John Schofield's smaller federal force on the road, and through a tangle of missed orders and confusion among his commanders, let it slip past in the night. Furious and convinced his army's discipline needed restoring, Hood pursued Schofield to the town of Franklin the next day, found him already entrenched, and ordered the assault that opened this story. Confederate accounts and Union tallies differ on the precise count, but the most careful modern reckonings place Confederate losses at Franklin near 6,000 to 7,000 men killed, wounded, and captured, against roughly 2,300 to 2,600 Union casualties. The toll among Hood's leadership was catastrophic in a way raw numbers alone cannot convey. 14 general officers were killed, wounded, or captured, 6 of them killed outright, including Patrick Cleburne, widely regarded as one of the finest division commanders in the entire Confederate Army. 55 regimental commanders fell as well. In some brigades, the ranking officer left standing by nightfall was a captain. An army can survive a battle like Franklin and still march, still hold a line, still fight. The soldiers who remained were, by every account, still willing. But an army also runs on more than willingness. It runs on the colonels who know how to maneuver a regiment under fire, the brigadiers who can read a battlefield and adjust an attack in progress, the sergeants who have survived enough fights to steady the men beside them. Franklin did not simply reduce Hood's numbers. It gutted the layer of experienced leadership an army needs to translate courage into effective combat power. 2 weeks later, when Hood advanced to the outskirts of Nashville and dug in to await George Thomas's attack, he commanded an army of perhaps 30,000 men that had lost a third of its combat leadership within the past fortnight, was poorly clothed for a Tennessee winter, and stood opposite a Union force of roughly 55,000 that Thomas had assembled with reinforcements drawn from across the Western Theater. A concentration only possible because the Union's rail and supply system could move men and material over hundreds of miles faster than the Confederacy could move a single division. On December 15th and 16th, Thomas attacked Hood's flanks, broke his lines on the second day, and sent the Army of Tennessee into a retreat that only Nathan Bedford Forrest's cavalry rearguard kept from becoming a total rout. Confederate losses at Nashville are estimated at around 6,000, a large share of them prisoners taken as the line collapsed, against roughly 3,000 Union casualties. By the time the survivors reached Tupelo, Mississippi at the end of December, the army that had crossed into Tennessee with perhaps 40,000 men numbered barely 21,000. On January 13, 1865, Hood asked to be relieved of command. The historical debate over what happened between July and December of 1864 has never fully settled, and the honest answer is that it should not. Some historians have judged Hood reckless, a general whose personal instinct for the attack outran his army's capacity to sustain one. Others point out that he inherited a strategic position already collapsing under Johnston's withdrawals, that Davis and the Confederate government expected offensive results he had little real freedom to refuse, and that waiting passively for Sherman to encircle Atlanta was never a genuinely open alternative. Both readings can be true at once because they describe different halves of the same problem. Hood's tactical choices at Peachtree Creek, Atlanta, Ezra Church, Franklin, and Nashville were shaped by real strategic pressures and real, if narrowing, opportunities to change the course of the campaign. But every one of those choices spent a resource the Confederacy had no functioning system left to replenish: trained officers, veteran infantry, artillery horses, rifles, and the rail capacity to move replacements to the front even when replacements existed. Sherman could lose thousands of men in July and field a larger army in August. Hood could not. That is the paradox this story keeps circling back to. An army can remain tactically capable, willing to charge fortified lines, willing to stand under artillery fire, willing to follow its commander into a fight it might well lose, long after it has become strategically incapable of sustaining the losses that kind of fighting requires. Hood's army was never destroyed in a single afternoon. It was consumed match by match, battle by battle, officer by officer, through a summer and autumn in which the Confederacy's capacity to replace what it lost had already fallen behind the rate at which Hood, driven by circumstances as much as by temperament, kept spending it. By the time that arithmetic became undeniable, on the frozen hills outside Nashville that December, there was almost nothing left to spend.